Hi there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I am, as always, Lucy Steigerwald, and here in the internet studio we have Alex Aragona, like Arizona. We discussed how to say his name before we went on air. And welcome to Alex, who is a partner at a creative marketing agency. He is also the host of the Institute for Liberal Studies podcast called The Curious Task, and he's a fellow at C4SS, Center for a Stateless Society. We like those guys and gals, and etc. And Alex's writing has appeared at c4ss.org, Adam Smith Works, and Liberal Currents. And hello, welcome.
Hello.
Let us start with you, if we can. We like to talk about you. Can you start with how you might describe your politics today, and if there was any kind of journey to get there?
Politics today, I guess I'm happy with sort of the most common label that you often find at C4SS, which is sort of like left market anarchists. Happy to talk about how I sort of think of that later. I'm assuming we'll get to that kind of stuff. How I got there, I'll just give you a brief overview. I'm not sure how much time I should spend on this. It depends however we go, I guess. But it's kind of an interesting story. Like way back when I was in high school, actually, I was sort of a little bit more what appealed to me was sort of a specific type of Canadian brand of small c conservatism, actually. And a lot of our American friends might actually think differently when they think of what the word conservative means. So maybe that's an interesting nuance to get here. But that pretty much means small township, leave me alone. As long as the other guy's not bugging me, I'm fine kind of thing. So stay out of my life type deal.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of what appealed to me in high school. I started reading some more stuff after that was a little more nuanced and got to different types of areas. And I sort of discovered lowercase l liberalism and the Enlightenment stuff like Adam Smith, and how that branched over to anarchism is what ultimately I think interested me in anarchism. And I'm just sort of speeding through most of the story here, but that's sort of what pulled me that direction, is sort of those Enlightenment liberal value type stuff that does what I think as actually some seedling stuff taken to its logical conclusion. Enlightenment liberal values actually get you to sort of like a leftish type anarchism. So I sort of threw a lot there potentially to talk about, but that's sort of a quick trace of my story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite interested in that. All I can think of is land bridge from liberal Enlightenment stuff to anarchism, because I believe you. I wouldn't be able to articulate a connection, but I'm immediately kind of halfway on board already. Because you are an anarchist who hosts a podcast that is a Friedrich von Hayek reference, which might confuse some of our listeners that there is such a person as you in existence. So I guess, can you elaborate more on that little bridge between Enlightenment and anarchism?
Sure. Yeah, and I will just say as well that the Curious Task podcast is at the Institute for Liberal Studies. So that institute is actually pretty firmly classical liberal. So that's fine there. And years ago, when I was sort of brought in to different sort of lectures that interested me from some of the professors they would bring in and so on and so forth, that's how I sort of ended up becoming part of those circles and so on and so forth. So I should stress that, the flavor of the podcast, or should I say the namesake of it, is the Curious Task, Friedrich Hayek reference. It's intends to be a classical liberal podcast. Different types of people are at the Institute for Liberal Studies. I happen, as you said, to be the anarchist guy, I guess, hosting it, which is kind of interesting. But if people listen carefully, I'm always sort of sprinkling in a lot more than you would find on any other, I would proudly say, in name, classical liberal podcast, different types of sort of more leftist anarchist type pushes. So that's kind of what I contribute there while exploring that sort of stuff. But to your question, like the bridge itself, yeah, like I think I want to be careful here too, right? Because I think let's just lowercase l liberalism in and of itself and anarchism are obviously distinct things. I'm not, an advocate for by any means, nor am I trying to, do one of those. It's actually kind of the same thing type of things that you sometimes hear in quote unquote libertarian circles when people are fighting over what the label really means. You get people that are like, my multiple hyphen connected compounded term that I like is actually what libertarian means. That's not what I'm trying to say by any means, but I
What a
am saying that
coincidence.
yeah,
Mine is
Yeah, I am though trying to point out though with that sort of statement that there are some really interesting threads that you can connect. Instead of going forward, let's actually go backwards. Like, so for instance, if you read some stuff like, when you're at about the mid, for example, 1800s to late 1800s, either in like, uh, writings that like, factory girls might have read in the United States, or stuff that the working class might have read, for instance, in in England. Like, there's a great book, for instance, called by Jonathan Rose, called something along the lines of The Intellectual History of the British Working Classes, or something like that.
Mm.
And when you look at that type of mid 1800s, late 1800s type of literature historically, you often find a lot of people in sort of working class sort of milieus, or even the people that decided to become more of the pundits and intellectuals of those type of milieus, whether they wrote in their pamphlets or their little working class journals that they passed around or whatever else. You do end up finding these interesting references every now and then, not only to Karl Marx but also to sometimes to Adam Smith,
Mm.
specifically as well, when in the United States milieu, when you looked at this sort of like libertarian socialist or more left libertarian type of circles, when they were talking about sort of both the anti-state and antitrust and anti-corporate and anti-economic power types of things. Every now and then, people like Smith or Thomas Jefferson, even with the sort of Jeffersonian Republican type of stuff, would actually sort of pop up. So I'm not saying that's the whole story. I'm saying, how do you get there, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
those people aren't making stuff up, and nor are they illiterate. Well, I think you get there by sort of looking at what the core sort of lowercase l liberal type of Enlightenment values in the most broadest sense were presented to be, especially in the late 1700s and very early 1800s, when you had people like Adam Smith and Benjamin Constant and stuff like that talking about things. And really, and I'm going very broad here, there's obviously specifics later in the story, but you really get high skepticism, if not rejection, of power dynamics, in the most broadest sense, taking the equality and dignity of human beings seriously. Like Adam Smith would remark, there's not much difference between the guy who lights the street lantern than the philosopher, except circumstance, for example, i.e., we talk about privilege economically and politically, etc. today, right? So these types of things, these type of seedlings, is what I think, if you kind of water and grow them, you kind of naturally, and you take the principles the most seriously, like the broadest type of lowercase l liberal, human dignity, rejection of power dynamic, let people sort of do their own thing and flourish as they see fit, as long as they are not imposing domination over each other, et cetera, et cetera. In that broadest sense, in my mind, if you take that ultra seriously, as you go through the decades, you would branch off to sort of what we would talk about now as like a proper type of left libertarianism or anarchism. I won't get too much into this now, but I think in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you sort of have a lot of, socialist type of authoritarian state type of panic. You have a lot of Marxist panic. You also have a lot of this sort of split in the sort of even lowercase l liberal community about really who's your friends, right? The people that are sort of in the working class libertarian socialist side, or big capital. A lot of big capital won that war for various reasons. There's a lot to unpack there in the 1900s, but
Mm.
that's how you sort of end up with a lot of corners of classical liberalism in, uh, let's say after World War II and so on and so forth, more being a game for American conservatives and sort of more uh, superficially Friedrich Hayek type of classical liberal people. So
Mm-hmm.
I just covered a lot of story there, and I know that was a bit rambly, but I hope that gives you an idea of what I mean. There's sort of this journey that you can take that gets you to anarchism from lowercase l liberalism. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
also a journey that gets you to being a little bit more sympathetic, unfortunately, in my value judgment, to things like corporations, economic power, and sort of this idea of free market capitalism and competitive enterprise that is not, in my mind, actually free market sort of, market-based anarchism type thing. So sorry if that was rambly, but it's a big question,
It is.
and I certainly haven't developed the political theory all myself around this. So it's a fair challenge, but I think it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just don't see a lot of people. I guess I know people who have taken maybe a similar path to you, but a lot of the time you have some random leftist who's like, "Oh yes, I was libertarian in high school and I cringe at myself." And, people of our ilk, if I may be so bold, tend to have built a little bit upon that stage of life and maybe incorporated it in a good way, I think, as opposed to dramatically rejecting it. And I just think your version of that is more it's more visible than some people's, I think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, that you point that out. Yeah, like, and I think it's also important to always remember that. I was about to say libertarianism in the United States, but as we all know, that term is always under some sort of siege, duress, or battle by many different factions. So I'm not going to just say that it means the same thing to everybody. However, I will say that it's also quite the post World War II uh, lowercase L libertarianism that you find in the U.S. Although there are many folks that would call themselves coming at that type of libertarianism from either a left liberal or left libertarian sort of point of view, for lack of a better term, the sort of more fusionist type of small c conservative, overlapping with constitutionalist, overlapping with Ron Paul, et cetera, et cetera. That type of American style libertarianism is also quite an interesting, unique historical fact that I don't blame people that might have been there or said that that's kind of the camp they used to subscribe to, sort of distancing themselves from that when they find themselves either later on either straightforwardly lowercase L liberal, or someone like me who will happily identify more as just a straight up anarchist or left market anarchist, because the American version of what's often presented as American libertarianism is pretty interesting in its own way, in many different ways that more overlap it with what I guess we can broadly and most charitably say a more conservative tradition. So I understand why people want to make that distinction.
I'm afraid that seems accurate to me, yes. I'm almost tempted to just start asking you about Canada's version of things that I know in the US. Because if you want to annoy a European, just call yourself a libertarian and then explain that you're, a big Murray Rothbard fan and stuff. Like, my social anarchist cousin and I used to have debates about this kind of thing. What do you find that this is absolutely something that's overstressed, but do you find that you fit in among anarchists as a group? I used to have clashes with them and stuff, and I feel like if you work for a classical liberal think tank, they don't tend to look very fondly on that. I mean, do you feel like you fit anywhere in the philosophical options?
Um, yeah, I know what you mean about that sort of feeling of general like homelessness when it comes to a group that you can associate with. I will say that, like, with some exceptions, and we can get to those if you'd like some people that somehow find themselves identifying as an anarchist, for example. You find these groups of people that, if you put them against, frankly, a red or some sort of, tanky communist kind of thing, like, it's like you can barely tell the difference between those. Like, okay, so except for those types of folks, frankly, I do
Mm-hmm.
find myself most at home with any various sort of flavor or color of anarchism that's in the room, even if I might, disagree or want to point out some nuance about something, especially as someone who is a happy to be market anarchist. If I'm more than happy to have that discussion, that what do I mean by market in the broadest sense versus whatever garbage is happening with whatever stage of capitalism we're at now. Like, I'm the one who's happy to have that conversation. Other people that might be more anarchist socialist or whatever, like, they might be like, either spare me, or they might be like, oh, that's very interesting, I don't come from that background, let me know more, kind of thing. But regardless of any tension in that room, if everyone's sort of on the same page with that sort of gut feeling of like anti-domination, whether it comes from the state, or anti-domination when they can just see it come from sort of even an employment dynamic, or like, the large sort of corporate neo sort of, techno feudalism, mercantilism that we have now, the people that can sort of in their gut, you know either casually or in a very intellectually fluffy way sort of identify that stuff and be against it, I find myself most at home with those kind of folks. So I don't find myself not sort of on the same vibe or wavelength as most people, I would say, that say they're straightforwardly um anarchist. um on the classical liberal side, I have to say the Institute for Liberal Studies, which is run right now by the executive director Matt Buffton, is probably and this is great to say, like, is probably the most straightforwardly lowercase l liberal and classical liberal organization you probably could find. A lot of people are using that term. Let's just stick with liberal for a sec, for about this classical liberal thing. The lowercase l sort of liberal in the traditional sense term, you know, unfortunately, infamously, Mr. Jordan Peterson, for example, decided to start spewing that around and throwing that around a little while ago too. So, and unfortunately, some more serious people than him started even, I guess, having a little brush with whatever they view as some sort of fame or whatever in their head, and they basically didn't mind that necessarily. Like, so there are some. I'm not going to be the one to do litmus testing and say faux or fake, but there's a lot of people that would take more classical liberalism and more sort of a conservative leaning type of sense, like in all these directions that I wouldn't necessarily identify with in any way. But luckily, the Institute for Liberal Studies is, and especially Matt Buffton, who is in many ways both to my many times agreeing with him and both to sometimes my disagreeing with him or raising an eyebrow, is sort of like a Mr. Classical liberal and liberal, straightforward down the middle kind of guy. Like, that's the kind of guy you're going to get the obvious sort of absolutely, here's a complete thing that we should absolutely be socially liberal on, no question about it. You know, if you're, we're anti-fascist, we're for, like, this ultra socially liberal stuff, and then on the other hand, there's stuff about like specific liberal institutions and all that kind of stuff that he would definitely like be for very straightforward on kind of thing. And if you're an anarchist, obviously at the end of the day, you wouldn't agree with this sort of ideal or not full out skepticism against, some of the things that classical liberals might say. Like, if you're a liberal, you're patently okay with some sort of state institutions, depending how they are kind of thing, most of the time. I'm not saying you're not skeptical of it. I'm not saying you don't think, as Thomas Paine would say, it's a necessary evil. It's either an unbearable evil or a necessary one, as Thomas Paine would say. But you'll notice in that statement is sort of the lamentation, we need this stuff. Well, the anarchists would ultimately disagree with that. I'm happy that the Institute for Liberal Studies is run by somebody who is like a straightforward, serious liberal, and that's a compliment if that's what that person wants to be. So I feel at home in that sort of microcosm. In the broader libertarian sphere, I often don't feel at home with a lot of what's going on there. I am not although I think Murray Rothbard and anarcho-capitalism is very interesting to talk about with the more serious proponents and thinkers in that sort of space. Either the people that take the Rothbardian approach, or, for instance, people that take a different approach to anarcho-capitalism, like a David Friedman. Regardless if you disagree with that person, I think these are interesting conversations to have, but don't feel that at home there 100%. So that's kind of where I'm at. So all that to say, in that other ramble, I've treated you to, so apologies for that. Anarchism does me just fine. But at the end of the day, what ultimately does me just fine is, we were talking a little bit about this before the show, is being in the country, using the sawmill with my neighbor, having a smoke and a beer after, and saying, if people would just leave us alone and the government would fuck off, then we'd be in a lot better shape. These are not a lot of people that I'm around in my sort of adjoined acreage here are not in any way the type of people are going to be doing podcasts like us, or even cracking open certain types of books. But I feel most at home with people that have that gut feeling, to be honest.
Yeah, I used to be a little more sentimental about certain leave me alone types, and I have cooled on them because so many of them are not really about leave me alone. They're about leave me alone and everyone else is getting interfered with.
Correct.
But
yeah.
I always I always think back on the whole end of civil disobedience by Henry David Thoreau once he's been bailed out of jail, and he's like going berry picking with some boys from the village, and he writes, the state was nowhere to be found. So whenever I hear someone talking about just like just ignore it as much as humanly possible, I always think about that.
Well, we have no local police department, for example. That's a treat.
Sweet.
The Ontario Provincial Police has jurisdiction by default when there's no town police. But honestly, like, even that stark difference is quite interesting. It's just interesting. I used to live in Ottawa, so in a suburb of Ottawa, to be accurate. But just it's interesting, even that sort of governmental presence not being there, even though just seeing the government or not seeing the government's not the whole story, obviously, because you can have private and sort of non-governmental forms of domination and terrible stuff, of course. But it does feel like a difference. It's interesting though. You said like cooling on the sort of leave me alone type people. I think that's, I'm not sure if you'd be interested in hearing about that or getting into it, but that's always something I found that there is like this interesting sort of Canadian style in the bush sort of small township, small C conservatism that I would always like distinguish from a lot of the things that I've experienced in the States. Not to say that these types of people aren't in, the States. There's millions of people in the States. Obviously, we can't generalize, but I think I agree with you that there is sort of also, unfortunately, this group of people that's very quote unquote anti-government, quote unquote anti-state, quote unquote for patriot, quote unquote for freedom, quote unquote for Thomas Jefferson. I'll just say quote unquote infinitum, but really at the end of the day, it's if I can get my guys in power and the institutions can be just set right the way I like them, and the kinds of people that I don't like aren't here, kind of thing, then they'd be happy, and that's certainly not what I was alluding to. So.
Yeah, as somebody who finds themselves disturbingly rooting for the status quo in November in the United States, how are the far right shenanigans in Canada? I mean, do you worry about sort of more organized movements the way that some of us in America are?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So I hear I'll ask, so please interrupt me or redirect me if I go too far again to a boring thing, because this is very interesting to me, but it might not be interesting to this question, because I think
You might have to explain Canada to some of the folks listening,
yeah,
and by that I mean me mostly. I've only ever been to Ontario.
yeah.
Canada is very small to me.
Yeah, no, and fair enough. And like I think Canada is one of those things, and I'm not just saying this because I happen to live here, and it's one of those weird people that live in Canada underdog things. But I think it's a lot more of an interesting uh, country and sets of cultures than is given credit for. I think a
Mhm,
lot of people, especially in the States, should pay more attention to it, especially since how, yes, although we can have a federal government that gets much too big, in many ways our constitution and the way things are set up accidentally libertarian all the time, like to the point where like in the States all you have to do to get around some states' rights is basically do something with the executive power. But in Canada
mhm.
there's a lot of things where like some things are so firmly, for example, provincial jurisdiction, or just some levels of government can't do that. It's very quietly a riot if anything sort of happens that way. But other than that kind of stuff, I will say at a high level, let's talk about like federal politics for a
Mhm.
second. It's always important to remember that, Canada sort of has a parliament, right? Not a republic style setup with like a completely separate executive. And, although unfortunately, party politics and factionalism is getting to the point in Canada now too, where, people aren't thinking of voting for their local representative as much as they are for a leader and for a party per se. Some of the parliamentary function still seems to serve what it's supposed to, like for our parties, especially since we have more than two major-ish ones right now, which a lot, we
What
have.
an idea.
Yeah, so what an idea. Like, so it's not necessarily in Italy mess where you have 18 parties that come together to make a coalition government, but we have sort of the capital L Liberal Party of Canada, which honestly is effectively just a capital P progressive sort of party at this point in time. That's really
So
what
for
they
good and bad, I suppose, in that
for
way.
good
I
and
mean,
bad, right?
yeah,
Like here's the
yeah.
camp of people that by default will signal easy low hanging fruit socially liberal stuff, like LGBT q plus rights and all that kind of stuff, and people that in this camp, a lot of people that probably listening to this, or a lot of people that are more socially liberal, are going to have no problem saying, yeah, that these people make the most default sense. But that's the good part. For the bad part, these are people that especially as part of the some parts of the Canadian old tradition, which doesn't have the sort of small government republic tradition of some of the states, like these are people that won't blink an eye twice at why the government should just expand rapidly into the school system, into whatever part of your life that you don't want, into spending billions of our dollars trying to quite literally label now each individual cigarette that comes out of a pack. So it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough that the pack smokes in Canada are
Oh no.
overtaxed, and you have the first you had just a little line, then over the years when now you have a dead baby on the pack. Now the government spent billions of dollars hiring more feds and Health Canada people to make sure that the brilliant, and I would have loved to be in these bureaucratic meetings, by the way, you know, how the government works nice. So it's like months and months of meetings for someone to say, we're going to try and label each smoke. So anyway.
If conservatives were funny, that would be that would be a conservative bit.
Yes.
You know?
Yes,
That's
exactly.
amazing.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, it's unfortunate. And actually, you know what? I'm glad you said that, because I can just, you sort of buttoned it nicely. I'll just say that you said for good and bad progressive, the bad part is, especially under recent Justin Trudeau rule, they've really like parodied themselves. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? As far as what that means to be a nice big government loving progressive. And I will also always say as well, which is issues that are very important to me and that I keep an eye on too, especially when it comes to Indigenous and First Nations rights in Canada. Indigenous and First Nations people always remark, and if you want to Google search APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network and stuff, they have their own news outlets and stuff. Some of it's like subsidized by the
Cool.
government stuff. Obviously much often ignored by the mainstream media, but they're often remarking that the government department that pays millions of dollars of salaries to bureaucrats and well-funded people and billions of dollars dump into this, more money goes into that department than comes out, right? And then these
Mm-hmm.
progressives will turn around and stand at podiums and say, look how much money we spent for Indigenous people and First Nations and stuff. So that's serious stuff, and it's bad, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so like we have that sort of capital L Liberal Party right now, which is sort of that progressive end of things. We have the Conservative Party of Canada. I'll return to them in a second because that'll be more to the point of right-wing politics in Canada. And then we have the New Democrat Party, which at a high level is supposed to be sort of like a European style Labor Party or a Social Democrat Party. I think, and I'm sort of personally have a soft spot for this and I'm biased for it, but years ago under a previous leader named Jack Layton, this was a legit type of not as much take corporate money or other sort of political vested interest type party. Of course, they all play the game and it's all BS. But at the end of the day, that was a party that had a little more street cred in my mind that could actually say, and this is in the early 2000s too, because you saw this on election maps. These are people that had seats in rural areas, had seats in deep urban areas. These are people that actually pounded the pavement a little with their social democrat labor type of message. You had oil rig workers in the rural areas of Alberta that could vote NDP and might be convinced to. And you also had sort of inner city progressive social democrat types of NDP. That's previous NDP history. Now I will say, if anyone wants to look into my value judgment, they're sort of more like honestly a sub brand of the capital Liberal Party, more of an urban style source of sort of type of little bit more progressive-ish social democrat party than the Liberals are. That's a different tragedy unto itself. The Conservative Party throughout most of Canadian history has always been sort of loose coalitions of different interests, but recently it's sort of genuine small c conservatives who might in some ways be looked at as those more I'm mostly socially liberal but hardcore fiscally conservative types. That's one section. Then under this umbrella of the Conservative Party of Canada, another faction would be sort of the genuine sort of more social conservative types. And then and all this sort of overlaps with a different grid where you sort of have most of the rural vote sort of tied up with this Conservative Party with some sort of urbanish, suburbanish type centers and stuff. So this broad coalition of people in the Conservative Party of Canada also sometimes make room for signaling to and also taking on, in my observation, the more farther right type of economic nationalistic and ethno-nationalistic type of messaging you would often hear that's unfortunately more accepted in the Republican Party now. So in Canada, a lot of the progressive critics and a lot of genuine left critics are critiquing the Conservative Party right now for playing a little bit into those type of sentiments. One thing that's interesting about Canadian politics is it's a lot more about tensions rather than just one message and trying to win an election. So in my value judgment, what you have is the party sort of playing into it, but sort of keeping it at bay. We'll see how that goes. That wasn't a very good strategy for the Republicans kind of thing. So that's sort of where we're at. Anytime that ethno-nationalism, far right type of economic nationalist stuff rears its head, anybody, well, especially someone from my seat like an anarchist, should be like absolutely concerned. I wouldn't be as concerned let me take a step back and say the Liberal Party of Canada is making its business to pretend that the Conservative Party of Canada is effectively the Republican Party. That is inaccurate, and that's actually helping the Liberal Party shoot themselves in the foot right now. Might be Canadian inside baseball that's boring for this podcast, but I will say that there's sort of some of those elements there, but not as much to worry about as I would be if I was in the States looking at the Republican Party and how you effectively have like a genuinely accepted infiltration of, right leaning and everything from right leaning to actual far right economic nationalism, ethno nationalism type of stuff. So we have similar issues here that might rear their ugly head. It's not as far gone. I will also say though too is that based on the way the seat system works in Canada, which you need enough seats elected to form government. You don't vote directly for the quote unquote leader here. So most parties know they have to appeal to most median voters most of the time in most ridings to actually form government, which actually acts like a bit of a check sometimes. So yeah, so I'm not sure if that already bored us too much with Canadian stuff, but that's the state of the union for our far right situation here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just always reminded that I try so hard to figure out the intricacies of this stupid government that all the other stupid governments on Earth, there's just so much to learn, including Canada, even though it's right there.
Yeah.
I do feel like for a long time people would act like this problem didn't exist in Canada, I think. Like in later seasons of The Handmaid's Tale, where Canada was once, a haven to flee from what was once America, and the plot has like sort of the far right element sneaking in and stuff. And I've seen Canadians on Reddit or whatever being like, yeah, no, that's sometimes you get, it's not just America, guys. So
yeah. No, it certainly isn't. There's problems up here too. I think and again, not to turn this into a Canadian podcast by any means about Canada, but I will say, Canadians are often like I'll say a couple things about that. The first point is some Canadians are often very conceited about the way they present Canada as sort of with this contrast effect to the United States. I mean, we have our domestic problems, both from that sort of far right perspective, but honestly also from a progressive left perspective. In the United States, I do not blame everybody from sort of like anarchists like me through to people that are playing party politics in the Democrat Party from sort of at many times joining hands and being like, regardless of all the other disagreements or shit that we might bash heads against, like this whole Republican Trump MAGA stuff must be destroyed. I totally, I mean, that's a tactical decision that makes sense. However, it should also not the sort of progressive sort of, I hate using the word in this context, but sort of that left-leaning style, sort of social democrat, sort of progressive style, mostly big state sort of slow tumble into authoritarianism can happen too. I mean, so Canada has that problem as well. Enough people in the urban centers, frankly, shake their fist enough at the time, and all of a sudden you have governments, erecting departments, throwing money everywhere, stomping on all the people's jurisdiction, and so on and so forth. So it is problematic. You also don't want a nice big red state, quite literally in your cigarette box, all over your firearms, frankly, and so on and so forth. So this actually, so there's a few issues there. So Canadians are a little sometimes conceited about, we have this sort of drunk neighbor that lives in the basement apartment type of thing, and we're so grateful to be up here. When in reality, I think there's a lot of things about American culture that Canadians need to actually learn to appreciate and actually say, I wish we had more about that up here, but also we need to look at our own house before we throw stones culturally. So I think that's one point I'll make about the King. See, on the other hand, though, I will say that there's also people making a cottage industry right now in Canada that fancy themselves more progressive, that are making it sound like we're on the verge, especially with the next election coming up, of tumbling down the Republican MAGA sort of hill. Justin Trudeau and his team figured out that polls well with some people. So in Parliament, they actually called our Conservative Party the MAGA Conservatives, which is obviously non sequitur because the Conservative Party is not trying to make America great from the Canadian Parliament. So, there's it's sort of a balance. We need to see things for what they are in Canada, but Canadians also can't be too conceited about it. I will make a funny remark, though, too, that the anti-tyranny stuff from Canadians is often funny, though, because a lot of the same crowd that's sort of the Handmaid's Tale sort of cheering people, especially when that rebel group finds that crate of guns or a way to bash tyrants over the head, a lot of those same people overlap with the yes, please take everyone's guns away people in Canada, which is a different subject I'm interested in. So I find that's a contradiction unto itself. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, there are too many Canadian rabbit holes to go down. My
Yeah,
grandma was born in Canada. Um, L.M. Montgomery is good. Like Canada, good old Canada.
yeah.
Um, but besides Canada, my goodness, what was I going to ask you next? Well, I guess we've gone too far down the Canadian road, though. I swear, like again, maybe this is just it just says something about the order in which I learned information, but I feel like I first learned about okay, well, America treated its indigenous people horribly, and then I like watched Rabbit Proof Fence, and I learned about Australia, and then Canada, even though it's right there, like suddenly all innocent, nice, the nicest country in the world, Canada, and you start learning about their First Nations people, and sometimes we pretend that it's just the United States that has done the nasty stuff. I think we like to be unique even in that sometimes. And,
Yeah, no, I think Canada has an extremely nasty colonial history when it comes to Indigenous people and First Nations. There, there's so much to trace. I mean, but like, I mean, if Canada became an official confederation in 1867, so let's just take that and go forward from there. I mean, there was ever since that, and obviously there was terrible stuff that happened before that. And people are now trying to patch up a lot of their weird guilt now by saying stuff like, oh, there were scattered people around, but nothing really happening, so we didn't really do much. Well, that's an interesting statement to make, especially since early government and colonial documentation is full of how do we get these people and their farms and their log houses out of here so we can put stuff here. So it's interesting when people try to pretend there was nothing here. But from 1867 onwards, there's like a terrible history of quite equivalent to things like in the States there was like Indian removal programs and things like that, so there's
mhm.
equivalent stuff to that in Canada. But obviously one thing you might have heard of, or your listeners might have heard of specifically, especially since there was a lot of brouhaha about it in the last few years after some remains were found in mass graves and so on and so forth, was the residential school system in Canada, which was which was essentially the government building schools, Christian schools, and this was a concerted effort. And I'm paraphrasing the quote, but it was literally about quote like teaching and removing the Indian from the child. This was actually the idea of the program. The idea was to
I
take
believe I was remembering that quote. It's like
yeah
save the man, remove the Indian. Like there was some
stuff like
little
that.
slogan about that I have also heard. Yes, because
Yes,
we did that too, of course.
exactly. So the idea was essentially they created incentive structures, and in some ways it's incentive structures which are obviously domination oriented and completely unjust, and other times it was complete forcefulness, but in terms of literal physical force being used. But nevertheless, basically the idea was, well, what we can do is we can ensure to ship off First Nations and Indigenous children to these boarding schools, take them away from their families, get them out of reserves and so on and so forth, and punish them if they were to try to speak their home language, make them read the Bible, learn English, and basically commit cultural genocide against these folks, because the idea was, hey, if we don't want to kill all of them, at least we can convert everybody and have them join what they viewed as polite society. So all that to say, there's a terrible colonial history. It's very disgusting. Progressives now, to tie it back to that, are comforting themselves with the current government with a lot of lip service to what they're trying to do. I mean, but you can rename streets all you want and remove statues and do whatever you want. But unfortunately, the cottage industry of progressives appropriating radical left language and watering it
Hmm.
down to bureaucratic government initiative, which doesn't do much except keep the current powers that be sort of in power. They made a cottage industry pretending to reconcile with this past. I wrote an article at C4SS actually about this. I have it on my other screen here. I'll just say it real quick. because I think this one's actually in this sense very key to what we're talking about here. It was called the not so funny joke of progressive decolonization, and that was inspired by Justin Trudeau actually using the word decolonize the Canadian government. And I remarked in that article, unless you want to dismantle all levels of government and remove yourself from your own position, sir, you're not decolonizing anything. So there's this sort of current progressive trend right now in Canada of these people comforting themselves with a lot of appropriated radical language, but really keeping the status quo going. And most importantly, not for me, but if you talk to Indigenous and First Nations communities now, they're not even entertaining one lick of an idea that something's been done in their favor, as much as it, at the very least, as much as it could have been, or at all. In their favor, kind of thing. So that's a very important subject there as well.
I mean, I think in the United States also you had a version of that with Black Lives Matter protest, and you had, Nancy Pelosi dressed in, I do not recall what you call the clothing.
Yeah, it was a garment, I think, right? Yeah.
Just kneeling and just like, and it was so weird and offensive.
Yeah.
And if tepid moderates, they could be honest, and Trudeau could say, let's slap a band-aid on the wound that was done, and actually in whatever way he might. But no, I mean, it's always the words, just the slogans. I think we get. Yeah,
it's one of those ironies that the small c Canadian Conservative actually stance on this is actually more honest, even if you disagree with it. I mean, Prime Minister Stephen Harper in the last Conservative government is the one that made the first formal apology to Indigenous people and First Nations and basically said this was terrible. It shouldn't have happened. If you go on YouTube, you could see the statement. He made the first official apology. It's sort of mainstream Canadian style conservatism at this point to sort of say this was terrible. It shouldn't have happened. Let's try and move on now. Which, I mean, again, if you disagree with it or not, at least is an honest, not literally in the Jesus sense, not hypocritical position. Like, it's sort of internally coherent. Whereas the progressive one, in my mind, and as I go through in that one article, is actually entirely hypocritical. We're talking about decolonizing, putting these people's needs first, and so on and so forth. And they certainly don't do that at all. And I am very forceful on this point because people that consider themselves to any degree radical politics or radical left are not progressive, but sort of sympathetic to sort of the idea that, oh, maybe the progressive thing's not perfect, but we don't live in a perfect world, so or at least some gains are being made there. On this particular issue, I'm very aggressive on it because it's almost better if someone's bullying you or outrightly racist against you, frankly, than doing what these folks are doing, which is using First Nations and Indigenous people when it's convenient and discarding them literally in the background in legislative and committee processes, and when they're actually time to make change happen, basically saying thank you very much, but happy to parade them around at a podium and act like their best friend or whatever cultural garment Justin Trudeau would like to put on for that day. So because that's a thing he likes to do too. So anyway, all that to say, yeah.
Oh God, yeah. It's funny. I feel like conservative people in the United States harp on Canada solely because of Trudeau more than they did. They actually think about him and fixate on him sometimes, how much they hate him.
Yeah.
So you finally got the downstairs neighbor's attention, I guess.
Yeah. And there's a bit of that that's absolutely warranted because I think he's in my personal value judgment, I think he's a very interesting person to have as prime minister. I think he likes public speaking. I think he likes being prime minister. I think he's very good at signaling a lot of things that progressive oriented people want to hear. I happen to know some people that have formally worked on the inside of Parliament in Canada, both in the Conservative Party and in the Liberal Party, staffers, pages, that kind of stuff. And the honest, low down truth, especially pre-2015 election of Mr. Trudeau, was that regardless of what he is, he's not really a respected policy wonk by any means.
Mm-hmm.
So he is really, honestly, in my mind, and many people that are anarchists should really take note of this, is that he really is, in my mind, that sort of poster child type of parody-ish type of progressive type of public speaking type of person that, and I think the most important part is that does a disservice to genuine left-oriented and socially liberal and progressive points by maintaining the status quo and being an empty elite trust fund baby person, but adopting all the language of radical left politics and honest progressivism. Even though I disagree with a lot of progressive politics, there is a form of it that's honest, and
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is certainly not this guy. I think, people got to watch out for that kind of thing. And frankly, a lot of it, I'll say as well, is just right-wing people like to bash what are nominally left-wing people. So that a lot of that's
Extremely nominally.
yeah, and a lot of that's honestly just a lot of hot air and uselessness. I try not to address it or engage with it these days. I mean, there are of course a lot of people, and I'm happy to critique those people too, that Trudeau liberal bad. So that's not very productive, but yeah, that's happening too as well.
Yeah, I mean, we get, Joe Biden obviously loves open borders. Barack Obama was, of course, a peacenik who apologized for America all the time. Like the version, the
Right.
right version of Democrat politicians always sounds like, oh wow, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Where do we get that guy?
Yeah, the Joe Biden that's described by some of his harshest right-wing critics is certainly not the Joe Biden I see when I look at the facts on the ground. And I think that actually has to do, honestly, with the lack of recent any style of labor politics or genuine social democrat politics in the States. I think there's a lot of frames of reference that are completely missing from a lot of mainstream American politics. You get people like, that guy's a socialist. I'm like, well, he is many things, but a socialist certainly not. Or nor a Marxist.
Not even a European one,
Not
usually.
yeah,
Like
not even a European left liberal. Like if we're being
Mhm.
serious, most of the Democrat Party, other than the language that they appropriate to signal to people, is very much just another faction of the corporate business party. That's sort of a type of conservative party in the States. That's pretty much what the Democrat Party is, regardless of what they signal. So yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. But people gonna bash it if it's in name, right?
Mhm. Before I have to make us go back to the beginning a little bit, I can't resist asking you about. I get stuck on land stuff because land being finite, the property rights thing doesn't apply the way that it does to this cup. Um, you were talking about First Nations people. Like, what do you see as the anarchist? What would be the moral solution to? There's no solution, but what would be justice, I guess, for First Nations people in Canada from your perspective? I must ask. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, you mean like in an ideal world type of sense, or like a
Yeah,
practical policy type of like what we can actually do with existing institutions sense?
both, sort of.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, in an ideal world, I'll say that if someone wants to Google search map of Indigenous and First Nations in North America and notice that they aren't square borders or weird squigglies drawn by Europeans, there's actually nice patterns and weaves and bobs and overlaps that often had to do with animal migration patterns and agriculture. I would say if we could snap our fingers in an ideal sense and all of us were to integrate with a more First Nations or Indigenous style system that you often like learn about with some of the nations, at least, I think you'd be closer to a version of anarchism than living under state capitalism, which we have now. So that's sort of in an ideal world. Obviously there's exceptions and we're generalizing, and we don't want to sloppily accidentally get into another racist problem, which is this idea of this quote noble savage, right? With that, you've heard of
Sure,
that
yeah.
type of mythology. But honestly, if we really look at the sort of rich history of indigenous markets and trade networks, there's this great book called Unlocking the Wealth of Indigenous or Indian Nations by I forget his name, but I had him on the podcast one time, and he was
Mm-hmm.
basically part of his book was really about the underappreciated, really advanced economic and trading networks that First Nations people had in North America. I
Well,
think, and he
yeah.
quoted, I forget my explorers that wear raccoon pelts, but it might have been one of the Lewis and Clark expeditions. I forget my
Mm.
American Norman Rockwell painting propagandas, but one of them had actually remarked that an axe, or it was some sort of item that was to be traded, made its way up through many sort of hills and mountains and basically more hundreds of miles north faster than he was able to journey because of the trading networks.
Well, yeah.
So the same sort of axe that was in like Arizona, let's say, ended up in sort of,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, where British Columbia is now type thing. I'm totally paraphrasing and mixing up some of the details, but that's a very interesting thing. So in an ideal world, I'll just short circuit it by saying if someone actually sort of really looks into the wealth in the broadest sense of both sort of the type of knowledge that was around, the type of trading networks that were there, and also some of the, the conflict management type of systems and the way people actually viewed each other in different ways as sort of a series of interconnected communities, like the Iroquois or sort of a confederation, right? You'd actually, if I could snap my fingers and just say, you know what, let's give these folks back and restore what they had before it was disturbed, that would be an ideal one. There's also this great series I think I saw in APTN. I was called off the top of your head, I'm not sure if you remember when Christopher Columbus sort of set foot. It's like 1492, I think. So if I remember
Columbus
correctly,
sailed the ocean blue.
yeah, there you go. There you go. I think this series was called 1491. So they literally said, okay, where are
I
we
think
at
there's a
in
book.
1491? And then,
Mm-hmm.
that was an interesting series too. So if people look up stuff like that, I would say these aren't necessarily unideal things. I would say from a practical perspective, though, I think I think from a practical policy making perspective, a lot of the progressive style politics roots for Indigenous and First Nations justice is a lot of fool's errand type stuff. Again, I have
Okay.
this article, The Not So Funny Joke of Progressive Decolonization on C4SS.org. It's mostly about rhetoric, but I hope people can also pull from that the joke of and the stupidity that comes from what kind of policy results in this type of stuff. I think there's a lot of things that especially anarchists, because a lot of that stuff is tactical decision making, should be a proponent of. If we can truly say, once you do the math on this or the sort of thinking, it's going to actually benefit Indigenous people and First Nations, this stuff on a microcosmic basis should obviously be looked at, and people should be proponents of it. But I think the overall framework of some sort of reform of this whole thing is a fool's errand, because it's really a larger distraction from a larger problem. Because you talked about property and land and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If we just start moving title deeds around between X corporate fictional entity and Y corporate fictional entity of Indigenous people that is now recognized by the Canadian government, because the Canadian government invented a sort of system of a way of recognizing Indigenous people that worked for them and their sort of state capitalism and all that kind of stuff. I think we're sort of missing the forest for the trees there. I think if we're talking about sort of discussions of current institutions and how things are looked at, I think it's more of a productive route to really look at how we think about land ownership and who is considered a person under the law, which brings us to the whole corporations or people thing. So can't get into all that now, of course, but I will say that the progressive sort of practical reform route is also sort of a fool's errand in my mind too. There's sort of bigger fish to fry that not only take Indigenous and First Nations rights in tow, but a bunch of other issues too. And a lot of it is, I hate to be that guy, but how state capitalism is literally arranged at its fundamental pillars, right? So that's to me, you start looking at those things and start looking at, how liberal democratic institutions work with private property and specifically corporations and corporate power and stuff. And I think that's a thread you want to pull on harder, and a lot of this other stuff comes on in tow. But in the meantime, of course, from a tactical perspective, if someone says this government is going to put $1 billion aside and give it to this First Nation council to spend as they want, I mean, we shouldn't say no.
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, there's so much land in the West that's owned by the federal government that, to me, that takes out some of the potential huge, disastrous, bloody problems that land reform type things. Just give it to descendants of slaves, give it to back to tribes. Like, it's right there. I don't know why it's yours, federal government,
Yeah.
I mean, that's also a way to, in some ways, that could be a simpler reparation, since it's just sitting there in a lot of ways. I mean, of course it would. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, especially on the slavery issue too, which again, Canada has to some degree, and they shouldn't be too conceited about this, but to not the institutional degree and historical degree the United States has. That's also an interesting one too, about how much we can actually trace and actually give people land back based on that type of stuff. That's quite interesting too. So yeah, there's some more practical things that can be done for sure, like that. But then again, then you have sort of the layers of the shit sandwich, frankly, right? Where you get the whole, the Indigenous First Nations people being disturbed, then, slaves were brought over. So then it's like the slaves are on top of Indigenous First Nation land that were first appropriated by a bunch of colonizers. So, and I'm not saying, therefore, we throw up our hands and not do anything.
Right.
I'm saying this is where we roll up our sleeves I don't mean we as in us. I mean everyone rolls up their sleeves and stops thinking in Twitter sort of character limits and gets into like, this is a nuanced topic we should all take seriously and really discuss the implications.
Yeah, too. Here, I mean, I'm pretty pasty. I'm not deciding anything. One of my, I don't know if I'm not, if I'm not really paying enough attention, but every once in a while, the whole hashtag on stolen land thing starts to concern me, in the sense that if you get too far down that road, is it not blood and soil? I mean, it's in a less obviously bad way, but I mean, can you do free movement while still having any kind of reparation for past wrongs in that way? I would like to think so. And again, we're not figuring this out right now,
Yeah.
but this is something that troubles me as a slogan.
Yeah, I think the whole I think a lot of, again, back to this whole thing. I think you'll like this article, actually. I'm not trying to plug it, but I really do think you'll like it. I picture you sort of nodding your head and saying, yeah, even if it's just my anger that you like tapping into in that one. But yeah, like I think like a lot of that, especially that sort of progressive style, sort of like there's always a land recognition. There's always something to be said about land. I mean, and that's another thing I think is actually comedic too. I mean, a lot of the progressives will start either a committee in parliament or a session. Oh, we're on stolen land. Anyway, moving on now, let's talk about this piece of legislation we're doing that might fuck over these people anyway. So I find that just a comedy and a farce, and actually, again, in the most Jesus sense, in terms of that philosophy, hypocritical, like in the worst sense. So that's a problem. Yeah, and I think that a lot of that land discussion really shows how steeped we are in sort of today, 2024, like business, corporate, land, title deed type of thinking, right? It's sort of like, here is square, give square back to people. And some people might think that's what solves it too, but I mean, we also have generations of cultural trauma and genocide to deal with. We have the fact that people have family lines that were literally holocausted that are not here anymore. We have the fact that, and this is something progressive people in Toronto that aren't near reserves don't like to think about. And this is, again, one of those interesting Canadian contradictions, that in Toronto you can signal all the right things, but the rural dweller that someone might dismiss as trailer trash has more experience actually with Indigenous people and First Nations people actually integrated into their community. These are people that would visit certain shops, whether the reserve is near, or there's Indigenous First Nations people, of course, that don't live on reserves. They just happen to live in certain areas that might be more integrated and stuff. So how do you de-integrate that, right? Because if you talk to some of those individuals in the community, some of them might say, and I'm just making up shit here, but he's like, yes, I am, such and such percentage, Algonquin First Nation or whatever else, but for 2 or 3 generations now, my family's run this gas station. What do we do about that? Do we say, okay, we gave you your land back, so go over there, no more gas station for you, we're going to give, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of nuances here. And all that to say, I agree with your point that this too much, I think, again, slogan's good. It might signal things to think about. It might get people angry. I think it might spark discussion, but we can't have the nuances based on slogans. And I think it is too steeped in like title deed sort of thinking, right? How do you do that? It does get you a little back to that blood and soil thing too, where we get into this creepy thing where I can picture a world where somebody wants to start blood quantuming specific Indigenous and First Nations people, be like, well, how much land do you actually deserve back? You're 1/16th Cree. How do we deal with that? There's an interesting guy on Twitter named Brett Chapman. He's an Indigenous or First Nations lawyer I follow. He has a post every now and then or a tweet about how blood quantum's bullshit, and he thinks that it's bad that not only white people, but also some of his fellow Indigenous and First Nations people will talk about it too much too. So yeah, I'm not personally an expert on this, nor do I have that lived experience, but from what I agree with what you said in the abstract, and also Brett Chapman, the guy I follow on Twitter, who's Indigenous First Nations lawyer, very proud of his heritage and is fighting in that area of law all the time. That's sort of an indication to me that we're sort of on the right track, I suppose. Let's watch out how far we go down there, right?
By the way, do you call them reserves in Canada? Because we call them reservations.
Yes, yeah. That's the way. And Canada is interesting, right? people in the East Coast and the Maritimes and the fishermen that sometimes I can't understand. If you talk to someone's grandpa, say things differently. Our West Coast friends in BC and Alberta say things differently. I happen to have more of an Ontario-based slangish thing too, and sometimes terms are even different. We do have the milk in the bags here, not the jugs. So
Yes.
lots of things.
My aunt used to buy that. I'd go up to Port Colborne in the summer. There was always the bagged milk. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that so lots
So
of things can be
weird.
different. So I don't want to say we call them reserves, but that's the way I was raised. As we said, there's
It
some
just took me a second. I was like, oh no, okay, yeah,
yeah.
reserves. Yeah.
The reserves, right? I have heard reservation too. Now I think about it, but that's the one that's mostly embedded into my lexicon kind of thing.
Oh my goodness, we skipped sort of the beginning and went down and jumped to lots of specifics. But I feel like if we can circle back slightly,
Of course.
you've dropped some names, Adam Smith among some others, but who do you have both dead and living influences that you would want to cite for the journey you've taken?
Yeah, like I think there's I can name a few. Like I think well, I guess I could start with, because I sort of had mentioned, right, that there's a lot of, like, I have sort of at the infancy of a lot of my political thinking was like lowercase L liberal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I think Adam Smith is very important. I can get back to that in a sec if you'd like. I won't dwell on it too much, but I'll say that a lot of his namesake and what he actually wrote, first of all, and it's essentially two major works, although they're huge. The amount of talking about Adam Smith by people who've only read second and third and fourth hand sources on him can honestly just be solved if people just on all sides would just read the damn two works. But unfortunately, his name's been bastardized and carried in many ways that by people that say they're proponents of his type of thinking. But I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about the real Adam Smith, not the caricatured one that a lot of people carried around. That's a big influence on me. The person who writes about power dynamics right in the middle of the wealth of nations and says stuff like, well, it's pretty damn obvious that whenever the interests of the workmen and the masters are in conflict, I mean, it makes sense to look at most sympathetically at the workmen kind of thing. Like, this is the real Adam Smith. So that's a huge
Mm-hmm.
influence on me. Thomas Paine, from an American perspective, very interesting influence. I mean, certainly not, although people like to quote him as if he's some grand master political theorist, he certainly wasn't. He was a pamphleteer and a journalist in
Mm-hmm.
some ways. But Thomas Paine was actually, I still have him on my Twitter cover photo because he's actually the guy that, even though he's hundreds of years old dead, I was one of the first people I felt that much energy coming off some of his pamphlets that I was like, even if I disagree with some things in here, like I get why you're angry, dude. And that sort
Mm-hmm.
of hard-headed sense of justice, to the point where toward the end of his life, he was still an abolitionist and very angry about things like slavery, and
Yeah, I only
lost a
recently
lot of
found
his
out. Mm-hmm.
founding father friends and
Mm-hmm.
networks that he had when they were all happy about common sense. Very happy about common sense, not too happy decades later about agrarian justice, which talked about one of the earliest forms of universal basic income and how
Mm-hmm.
inherited land
Didn't know that.
ownership is inherently sort of, although it's nice people have land and they can mix their labor with sort of their stuff, and the output is theirs. Thomas Paine would grant that. He would say land is inherently sort of, he was sort of the first guy, one of the first people to put his thumb on, like, this is sort of a little inherently unjust, right? There's only, like
Mm-hmm.
you're saying, so much land. Some people just are given it. How do we even out the scales? Well, we certainly can't go around destroying people's lives, because he was a liberal after all. But anyway, so that kind of stuff. And then you push
Sounds
forward.
relatable, yeah.
Yeah. And then you push forward too, and controversial name in anarchist circles directly, but I'm always careful to point out here, as a geopolitical commentator with a flavor of anarchism, Noam Chomsky was a big influence on me. I think it's a
Mm.
mistake to talk about him as sort of an anarchist thinker per se. I think he's a self-identified anarchist. I think most people that really look into stuff he's written and how he focuses should frankly note that, other than some allusions and some, and I've actually written an essay about this on C4SS, he's often actually a little sloppy when it comes to, I hate to call it this, but for lack of a more concise term, quote unquote anarchist theory. He's often very sloppy with that kind of stuff. But for someone to sort of come at a lot of geopolitical commentary and critique of current day institutions from a very, I've read a million books and I'd actually want to get to the bottom of it type of attitude, and just simply present his opinion in a not screamy, podcasty, pundity, or sort of like sort of like a YouTube Shorts type of way.
Yeah.
That was influenced me. And of course, I don't mean this podcast. I run a podcast myself.
Podcasts.
I mean, yeah, I know. That's enough podcasts. That should be the title of a podcast we do together. That's enough podcast.
Yeah, that is a good title, actually.
Yeah. So like he was an influence there too. But honestly, when it comes to specific anarchist influences, I mean, I got Benjamin Tucker. I like I like I always blank on this one name. I don't know why, because I get it mixed up with something else. Okay, so Emma Goldman, Benjamin Tucker. I get her mixed up for some reason because I saw this photo of Isabel Patterson once, and I have a bit of ADHD, a touch of that kind of stuff, so I visually swap them in my head, so I screw up people all the time.
Libertarians prefer to claim Patterson.
Exactly.
I don't know enough about her.
Yeah. So I one time I just like face to named wrong, so I always flip it, so I'm always careful with that. But honestly, a lot of it might sound pretentious, but honestly, a lot of pamphlets and working class literature is a lot of the stuff that drives my sort of anarchist sort of feeling. I think that especially the one book, like the intellectual history of the British working classes, for example, by Jonathan Rose, people's journal entries and people's sort of small town article type of essays and that type of stuff. The average person being able to detect domination and things that are inherently unjust, that kind of stuff is honestly the stuff I feel like I hope I tap into when I'm doing my anarchism, and that's the stuff biggest influence. I can name a bunch of names, but beyond that, honestly, I would highlight that the most. So basically at the end of that, I mean, like John Stuart Mill, when I had my more lowercase L liberal hat on, for example, I mean, like that's huge. I think there's another person too that if you take two quotes out of his writing, you end up with some sort of, well, that doesn't sound about right. But if you actually look at his writing as a whole, there's a lot of interesting stuff there, including when he himself started looking into what the socialists were actually saying and thinking about that sort of stuff. So that's quite interesting there. But yeah, sort of a mix of all these people in a blender, plus some working class pamphleteering, and that's how I sort of ended up where I am. Those are my bigger influences.
Truly, this is backwards, but I don't know if we really hit just on basically, again, to generalize all anarchists, anarchism, the movement, whatever. What could they learn from kind of the classical liberal people you're citing? What do they need from classical liberalism? What might actually, give them a nice shot in the arm or what have you?
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's a lot of preemptive dismissal, I think, of just usually those are the guys that right-wing people cite. Haha, invisible hand, go burr, or something.
Yeah, no, it's true. Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's exactly right. As one modern liberal scholar said, Jacob Levy, it's sort of like, a lot of the conservatives, if they're sort of the Rome, the classical liberals are their sort of Greece, they take what they like from classical liberalism, go off and build their empire, and whatever Greece or those philosophers actually saying it is not as relevant. Yeah, I mean, I would say if you've arrived at a sort of anarchism without adjectives or a specific flavor of either any kind of free trade, free market type of anarchism, however you've arrived there, I'm not gonna, if you're there, whether it's like left market anarchism, Georgism, whatever, I would say that I'm not going to come around and say, well, you're probably missing something, you should read some of these lowercase L liberal type folks, not that they're not interesting, but because if I talk about, for instance, the dignity of the individual and taking that sort of seriously, an anti-domination stance, but also letting people interact with each other with however they want to interact, form groups, trade, etc. I mean, it's not like I'm going to say, hey, you're missing something there, although some of that stuff's interesting. But what I will say that some people might be interested in is the fact that, again, in the late 1700s, early 1800s milieu of Enlightenment style type of liberalism and the real Adam Smith, it's interesting to go learn about how and why there's the real Adam Smith and real Enlightenment liberalism. And by real, I don't mean my version of it. I just mean go read the actual text. I mean, they're there for everybody.
It's a weighty text, I believe. Yeah. It's
like, that they're not copyrighted anymore. It's sort of like, go read the stuff and then go compare that to the many times unfortunate stuff many so-called classical liberal either think tanks or writers write, and really go compare those two things. And that's actually a learning experience unto itself. So whether you're a Marxist or an anarchist or anybody, I think through that process, you'll discover a lot of things about lowercase l liberalism that sort of, again, go back to sort of the fundamental feelings that people had about anti-state, anti-business power at the time, merchant power, right? These are arcane, like, these are archaic terms because Adam Smith he envisioned merchants and large companies, like a Hudson Bay company. Adam Smith could understand if you talked to him about that. Today's the large Apples and Amazons and huge corporate power stuff, it'd be hard for these people to fathom. And honestly, how they might be default against that type of stuff would be interesting in and of itself, because I believe that Adam Smith would, frankly. I believe if you showed Adam Smith here in 2024, for example, we have these new things, this new fictional entity type of stuff of free incorporation. They had corporations back then, but they were often by government charter, right? And if you told Adam Smith, for example, we have free incorporation, we have people with huge balance sheets, they're effectively people. If I go to Mexico as a corporate representative, I have more rights than an individual at times. Like, if you told people the world was going to trade and be like this, I think he'd be against that kind of stuff. That's a learning experience unto itself. And it's not because these people were hyper focused on making trade efficient or commerce efficient or some justice about merchants. It's actually because underneath it all, a lot of these earlier Enlightenment style lowercase l liberals were actually genuinely interested in who and what we were as creatures, accepting us as dignified creatures worthy of respect from their fellow creatures, and what type of institutional systems would be the best to not only allow us to flourish with our own dignity, but to also have some sort of set institutions or rules of the game in place that would allow for the most of that, regardless if one disagrees with the conclusions or prescriptions or observations or whatever that come down the road from that. That being the core of lowercase l liberalism, if someone doesn't understand that's what it really is, because in my mind is, that I think would be the shot in the arm. And even if you disagree with some people, ultimately, you can learn a lot from that type of literature, I think, both from a historical perspective and also, um, how some of these principles could apply today. Again, like, it shouldn't be a mystery why you have some working class people in the States and more libertarian socialist factory girl type pamphlet people that are upset about the fact that through economic circumstance they've been forced into factories and off of their own what should have been their rite of passage of their own small, quaint land ownership and being a free person in that way. Why these people have at times, in the names like Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson do come up. That's not that's not a riddle like, oh, geez, it might have been happenstance. There's threads that stretch up from Enlightenment liberalism to libertarian socialism. They're not, I'm not saying that they're the strongest things that basically say X is Y and therefore ABC, but they're there. And that history unto itself is very important. And it will also tell you a lot about how you get more of a libertarian without the lowercase l liberal story. I think you have a blind spot as to why libertarian socialism is a distinct thing from state authoritarian socialism. Like, without that lowercase l liberal shot in the arm or frame of reference or where these seeds were planted and what trees grew and what branches came off it, you have a blind spot as to understand, well, why is, when a libertarian socialist says they're a socialist, why is that different from a Red Army socialist or a Stalinist, right? Like, I mean, of course, many people on the right side of things would, the right-wing side of things, want to just say, well, socialism, it always ends up with, Stalin and USSR and all that kind of stuff. Whereas someone who's a libertarian socialist will be, well, I don't mean that, here's why, kind of thing. But if that person actually doesn't sort of understand literally why those traditions actually split and why Lenin was calling people that were about dignity, local control, and local sort of individualism and community sort of cooperations, why Lenin was calling those people infantile leftists, you're gonna sort of miss a chunk of that story. And I think a lot of it is based somewhere in Enlightenment liberalism. There's regardless of how that vine crawled up the wall, it's there. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or was even interesting, but that's what came to mind.
I tend to give the word socialism a wide berth, partially because of what I read in certain brain-forming years, but it's also been used for too many things.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's really the USSR and Sweden and individualist 19th century anarchists used it as well.
Yeah.
Is it very illuminating a word? I don't know. I just try to, I leave that over there because I don't know what to do with it otherwise.
Yeah,
but
I try to avoid its usage too. Yeah.
If I'm not I don't know if Spooner ever used that word or not. I guess I would have to check on that.
I'd have to check on that one too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been evacuated of meaning for sure. Like, I mean, like I think there's a context of this podcast and our understanding between each other. I think when I threw left, libertarian, socialist versus I think like I think most of the listeners will understand exactly what I mean. But yeah, like on an average daily basis, the word, let's call it the naked term, socialism without adjectives, has been evacuated of any reasonable meaning. That I think that, frankly, people that attack socialism with no qualifiers should honestly be a little intellectually embarrassed. Like, it's getting a little silly from right-wing people and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Socialist, that's embarrassing. But also, I think people that want to be a proponent of whatever thing that they're envisioning are also doing themselves a bit of a tactical disservice, regardless of etymology, of just throwing that word out there, because it's been both evacuated meaning because of people that attacked it and their propaganda, but also people that wanted to use it and the good parts of basically the seeds of socialism for their own sort of authoritarian gain, a la USSR and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of historical issues with even using the term. And frankly, liberal is evacuated meaning. I want to be clear. Like, sure. There's definitely more than 10 people listening to this right now that thought exactly that thought. It's like, well, Alex, you threw the word liberal. That's true. I readily admit that. I don't, other than in the context like this, where I think most people understand the kinds of things I'm touching on. I think, if you just say I'm a liberal, for example, that needs to be, which I'm not, but I'm saying that has to be qualified in that way too. And I don't mean to say I'm not liberal in the sense I don't overlap with any of those sentiments. I mean to say, that's why I say, look, what C4SS sort of coins and pushes is actually more my flavor. I'm a left market anarchist. Anarchist means something. Market means something. Left is sort of a signal a bit, how to categorize yourself. I'm happy with those three things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I suppose I can credit, I'll just full on drop names, probably like both Jason Lee Bias and Corey Massimino for helping me maybe articulate in my own mind that, again, not a liberal, not a self-described liberal, but liberalism is necessary to me within anarchism. Not that I'm going to go about mandating it, but what to me is kind of the essence of some Enlightenment stuff. Like, the reason why Antifa, I'm not, they're not, I'm not going to fully condemn them, but just like the First Amendment crap and certain liberalism that is out of fashion even among Democrats and stuff, because sort of it's assumed that it'll cause Nazis to thrive, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they're like liberalism within anarchism. Maybe that's just one of many flowers blooming. I don't know, but I don't think there's any contradiction there as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, me neither. And I think my sort of personal political theory around this is basically, like I was saying, I think there's a thread, and like I said, I think the metaphor of the tree I keep going back to. It's basically, the seed was planted in the Enlightenment liberalism. Tree grows. It drops things, it pollinates. Maybe other trees grow, maybe other branches come up, fall off, whatever. Take the metaphor the way you want, but the seeds that were originally there, you get this growth eventually towards a type of marketish anarchism, or anarchism without adjectives, and the most broad type of liberal Enlightenment ideals of human dignity and flourishing and so on and so forth sense. That I agree with exactly what you said there. That in that type of broadest sense, like, liberalism to me is a key part of anarchism. But here we have liberalism not as a political ideology or an institutional ideology, not in that sense of the term, but sort of that sort of as Adam Smith's one of his major works, right, Theory of Moral Sentiments, but as a moral sentiment. As a moral sentiment, liberalism to me is a crucial part of anarchism. I think if you don't have a moral sentiment of Enlightenment and liberalism in your anarchism, you get a little bit close to flavors of what some people call anarchism that are sort of a lot of, and there's quote unquote, I hate to use these terms here, right versions of this and left versions of this, but things that are anarchism in essentially the sense that there's no state, or there's no overarching bureaucracy or monopoly on violence, but you get something that doesn't look like, in my mind, an ideal area I would like to live with.
You get Hoppians and such, perhaps.
Yeah, on one side, you get that sort of feudalism and monarchies, and that sounds great as long as there's no state kind of thing. And on the other side of things, you get these, for lack of a term, ideals I would disagree with when it comes to sort of very hardcore type of communistic type of ideas of anarchism. And I know that's a whole basket of nuance unto itself, and I'm not trying to speak out of turn about it. I mean, like, I know there's parts of that I would absolutely agree with in terms of their sentiments, but there's some people that methinks construct a little bit too much specific detail about the anarchist society they're going to have. That's always a call for skepticism, which brings me back to the liberal sentiment. A sentiment, one key liberal sentiment is to be very skeptical of someone who draws out too much of a plan for anything.
Oh my God, Hayek.
There we go. We arrived at Hayek. Exactly. So
we did it.
Yeah, we did it. Yeah. Cheers for us. Yeah.
That is actually, having absolutely not directly read Hayek. I mean, no full books, mere dabbling, but the idea of the lack of knowledge, that is a huge blind spot to me within leftist circles. And I'm trying to remember oh my God, the guy who wrote Seeing Like a State, and what I read,
James C. Scott,
yes, I believe so.
Yeah.
He had a different term about sort of, I mean, he talked about local knowledge, I guess. Maybe that was kind of the idea. But just like the impossibility of central planning. And I feel like nobody can give that up, including leftists including anarchists, as you say. And yeah, maybe a sprinkling of Hayekian humbleness in that way.
Yeah.
About, oh my gosh, what is the...
You're talking about like you're trying to get to like spontaneous order kind of thing, or like...
I was literally trying to remember the slogan, which I originally learned undoubtedly from the Keynes versus Hayek rap video.
There's
a lot to learn.
Yeah, no, I think there's like there's the practical tactical stuff, which is if you want to go plan an economy, or even even somebody that's a genuine leftish type person would say like, no, I don't want to plan a whole economy, but I think we have this community here, we have these different confederated bodies of XYZ ABC, maybe it's like, look, it's like from a tactical practical perspective, we should all readily admit you might be able to scale that up to like 100 people ish. I know I'm not trying to draw a line where that this group of trees officially becomes a forest, but we can command economy probably on a small scale, but at some point, like, there's reasons that actually breaks down. You'd be more better off with a series of confederated sort of small groups of people that are making their own plans, which sounds like you're heading a little bit more towards some type of market-ish based type of thing, even if you're not a market anarchist. But like, there's a practical element to this too. But to me, there's also like a justice and morality element to this too, which is anybody that's genuinely convinced of their vision of the way their ideal leftish, or some people, anarchist society should be. A couple things to worry about there. Number one, a lot of it, I would suggest everybody pushes those kinds of people on how are you going to get that to happen. A lot of it creepily starts sounding like top-down type of structures, even if there's no state. That's the first problem. And the second problem is I'm very skeptical of people in those sorts of intellectual positions. It's going to work like this, it's going to work like this, because, there's almost sort of this implicit undertone that there's going to be people doing work and there's going to be people doing this. Of course, not everyone's suited for this, but of course there's always some sort of class, or maybe not a class, but a cooperative section of people that are a little bit more high-minded. They'd like to lead a little more. They have a little, oftentimes people that are talking about more top-down sort of vision and planned-oriented stuff, they, from what I can tell, don't fancy themselves as the people turning the wheels. They often fancy themselves as the people that would be part of the group of people that are going to be planning and thinking, and the ones that have the blueprint. In other words, and
then you get your Soviet unions.
Exactly. So it's like, I think
I would prefer to be in the middle also, which is like, can I not be at the planning committee every day, but I also don't want to do the manual? Can I just sort of find a nice middle ground? Are we going to have those in this
Yeah, well,
society.
it's interesting because I tweeted something, although I'm not on there a lot. And I think I saw that you liked it, but somebody was starting this thread of, here's why feudalism wasn't that bad type of thing.
Yes,
It was a
yes.
stable
Yeah.
system. Everyone had a place. And I remarked sort of a similar comment. The guy actually, or gal actually, I don't know, it was one of those anonymous accounts, I think. But like had one of that sort of, if you just Google search feudal structure, you probably get that sort of triangle thing at the top, the king, at the bottom, the serfs, in the middle, the knight class, and this. And I'm like, nobody that talks about, the feudal system wasn't that bad, would ever think of themselves as below, at least I say, the knight class. You know what I mean? I
Yes.
don't think everyone
Yes.
wants to be the king. I really don't. And I think people are honest and they say, no, I don't want to be the king. But you're also
Mhm.
not corn peasant 5,682. It's like those people are not
Correct.
thinking that. So that sort of rounds off my point there, is like, there's a practical issue of planning everything that's not going to happen because of knowledge problems and coordination issues. But there's also a moral injustice thing. I'm very skeptical of people that have the grand plan. That to
Mhm.
me is, at the very least, you'd be skeptical of these idealists. At the very most, we should be very scared of these potential tyrants. So there's a spectrum there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of revolutions I can think of were certainly morally justifiable, but then things get pretty weird.
Yeah. Another Thomas
Little,
Paine type of thing, right? He was in France all gung-ho on revolutions and so on and so
oh,
forth, but then also was looked at by a lot of people on the more revolutionary side after as some sort of dirty Tory, sort of faking himself to be revolutionary, because he was
sure.
sort of skeptical that maybe we shouldn't just start throwing everyone in the guillotine, right? Like, should there be a
Maybe
semblance?
not.
Like, you know what I mean? He was sort of like, let's not, he was certainly not someone to say that nobody should be thrown in the guillotine, but he was also
Yeah.
like, this can't just become like, and he was actually making an interesting point there. He's like, this cannot become an institutionalized and normalized tool to just chuck people in, right? Like, then you have a different problem. And that brings us back
And,
again to that liberal moral sentiment.
mhm.
So,
And plus, we're going to have the monarchy back in 2 decades anyway. We're going to have Napoleon. I mean,
right.
talk about not worth it. I mean, really.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Sorry, French Revolution. Um, I guess this is way too open ended as well. I had to do my pre question apologizing, but I still. I still like, I feel like the general anarchist without adjectives doesn't know the good word about markets. But at the same token, do you have any sense, in your opinion, when does a market become a corporation? How do you sort of differentiate the goodness in an exchange from the
Yeah.
corporatism that rules us all and stuff?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times when people think of this question, they rightly start at that sort of problem of scale discussion, right? Like, it's one thing for
Hmm.
someone to perhaps trade a bunch of corn. It's another thing for them to sort of say, hey, like, I have enough corn now. Now I can maybe start a little business here. I'll give this other guy 10 corn a day if he wants to work for me and help me harvest the corn, and so on and so forth. And a lot of I was in a debate / argument with somebody the other month in Twitter, and basically like, oh, well, if you do all that, you end up down the line, well, you just reinvented capitalism, congratulations. Well, I think the way I approach this question is that it's not as much of a scale question as much as it is an institution and law question. And I think that
Okay, yeah.
because a lot of our minds are often rightly, but I think we're also all living in the wake of the Cold War mentality, which is you get command economies and you get, like, free market enterprise economies. And we're sort of all steeped in property, title, and trade and commerce thinking, and how we can't blame ourselves because that's what we've been propagandized into, really, by osmosis. But there's a bit of a scale question involved here, because I think that you can have economic power and maybe that could be unto itself from scale. But I think that there's another angle we need to take the conversation, which is what institutions and what types of laws and what types of things are around us that enable what are rightly identified as the terrible problems of, the current state capitalist arrangements. And
Hmm.
one of those things is, and although it's boring and wonky, but it's very important to understand. So one of my book recommendations would be a book called The Transformation of American Law by a scholar named Morton J. Horowitz. And it's the first volume is like right after sort of American Revolution to like the late 1800s. And the second volume gets into the 1900s and so on and so forth. And to really understand how common law and legislation in the United States evolved to truly favor the merchant class and eventually create the fiction we know today as corporations, and start giving those fictions after that more and more rights and so on and so forth. So this isn't natural stuff. This is stuff we created. This is
Mm.
judge and intellectual and scholar made law. At the beginning. Later on, it's a lot of legislation from the American progressive era. Now I'm not talking about modern progressive. I'm talking about the American progressive era of them trying to get the best and brightest and coolest heads of the sciences and the institutional engineers and so on and so forth together. This is stuff that's created along with like all the power that the state has, right? So, and I know someone might be rolling their eyes right now because I can hear that voice in my head. Someone going, here we go. There's like, Alex is a crypto right libertarian. Actually, after all, he's saying it's the state that caused. No, I'm not saying that, because there's a lot of private domination and non-state problems, tons of them actually. But having said that, I think what I would say is that it's not just a discussion of scale and economic activity and when someone becomes too rich or something like that, or when they have too big of a business. It's all about how, for instance, these institutions are arranged and what rules of the game we're playing under. Now, not only how corporations were created in fictional, but also how property is treated. What is considered property today? I think most of it, I shouldn't say most, because I actually haven't ever Excel sheeted this or anything, but a lot of it, I'll say, is bullshit, frankly. Like, like we can just take intellectual property, chuck pretty much all that out the window. That and
Sure, let's do that.
And I think, like, though a lot of people superficially are against copyright and are against patents and so on and so forth, which I think is the right position to have, because that's what I have. I think the actual nuance of how much screwiness happens in laws and legal systems that can affect the wealth of certain families and people and corporations, we really need to wrap our minds around how treating something as property in our system, in our system of law, how much of a downstream effect that can have on economic power, economic wealth accumulation, the protection of that, and a lot of it in an unjust way. So, like, that's another area that's like, what's considered property, right? There's a lot of layers to this cake, right? So some people think it's only a short time before those market anarchists get a few food trucks and corn going until someone else wants to have the corn empire. Well, I honestly, although some people might be tired of hearing this argument, I challenge someone to build that corn empire in a real market without any actual corporate law or corporate institutions, without any modern conception that we have today of private property, because I think that that's a huge problem too. Because remember, these layers start intertwining too. When you have fictions on paper with non-accountable executives with limited liability able to own hectares and hectares of property without doing anything with it, for example, you know what I mean? And calling on the state to enforce vacant trespassing laws on vacant hectares of land somewhere in northern Alberta or the southern Yukon or whatever. These are all intertwining nexuses of things. That, to me, is the path to understanding. Like you were saying, where's that line? Like how do we think about this sort of good part of the market versus the bad part of the market? I'm not going to be as naive to say everything I like is market and everything I don't like is capitalism, but I will say
that's my answer. No.
Yeah, that's well,
the most unconvincing yet satisfying answers. Pat yourself on the back.
But I like to I should say I like to sometimes think of it that way, half jokingly, because there's a lot of truth in a lot of ways we can get that slogan actually helps, because there's a lot more that meets the eye, and if you even just superficially want to like look at like common law and corporate law, etc., it's not just the fact there's corporations on paper that can donate to political parties. That's a problem. It's not just the fact these guys exist and are big and are huge and all of a sudden they employ militaries worth of people. Like, these are problems unto themselves, but deeper, there's underlying structures of power and rules of the game that create such perverse protection for incumbent political elites and economic elites, and actually not only protects them, but helps build their wealth to the point of what we have today. That's, to me, the angle one should take to the problem. And for all those people that are pro-capitalism that say they don't like socialism, to be clear, they enjoy a shit ton of socialism. They love socialized losses and
Mm-hmm.
privatized
Yeah.
profits. That's the name
Yeah.
of the state capitalist game, to socialize your losses and spread them across the general populace, either through direct subsidy or different ways to pass it down, and privatize your profits. So state capitalism is full of socialism in that sense. I'm not trying to bash it in the way
Right.
I'm talking about flipping right now the stereotypical I'm a pro-capitalist guy, I hate socialism. It's like, well, sir, you might actually like a lot of socialism. I think Newt Gingrich at one point in the 90s had an article written about him that he was actually the senator responsible for the most subsidies to go back to his state for the
Well,
Boeing
sure, you got to
Corporation and
get
stuff.
yours.
Yeah,
Yep.
so the thing is like, on the one hand, you're in Congress or wherever he was talking about free markets and great stuff, and Bill Clinton was all about that in the 90s too, apparently. On the other hand, got to protect the Boeing Corporation. You know what I mean?
Ugh,
So
that's worked out well for airline safety, hasn't it?
exactly, and that's another thing too that you bring that up too. So if you allow me, and I apologize in advance for to continue a bit of a rant here, but I think that the protection aspect too, right, the liability aspect of this is
Mm-hmm.
extremely perverse. There were some in the Transformation of American Law book that I was citing. I think it's very great. People should read that. There were some interesting problems that I think small in the late 1700s, early 1800s, rule-based agrarian-style communities had to deal with. I mean, there's quaint questions at the beginning where, judges were sort of pondering, okay, this guy hired two people, one of them dropped a bag of wheat. Now we have this weird problem we've never dealt with in law before. If someone wants to sue, who do they sue? Do they sue that guy's helper, or is the helper really working under the command of the owner? So it's like, who's really at fault here? So there's interesting, quaint questions like that. Well, skip ahead. That looks like literally like a quaint daycare discussion compared to the types of liability questions we have now. Like, we are at multiple layers of liability where corporations can make billions of dollars of investments, drop full mine shafts worth of rocks on the people's heads, and whatever CEO or whoever made that decision is not liable. Now, from a progressive slogan perspective, it's, oh, you're not liable, tax them, fuck those people. But from a nuanced market anarchist perspective, the law is set up like that. These people are playing the rules of the game. Progressives often lead people astray by making it sound like there's a fair game, and these people are circumventing it by being sneaky with Cayman Islands bank accounts.
Yeah.
And but no, this is the game. The game is set up like this, and unfortunately, the way I look at it is the people that are benefiting the most off it just play the game the best. They have the military of lawyers and managers and executives and investment bankers, whoever else, that help them play the game the best. So the game is out there. I think the angle to understand it is understand the game itself, if you see what I'm saying. So it's not necessarily a question of scale, I think, as much as it is a bunch of things I said there, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And yes. I find myself stuck on, like, and this is largely a moral panic, but obviously, like, shoplifting happens, right? And let's just say I'm neutral about that. But if you're thinking about shoplifting from, like, a Walmart, but you also think property, sort of certain property foundations are essential, but then you can say Walmart is, bad for all these reasons. And a lot of well-meaning people that I know are sort of, without realizing it, are asking poorer people to wait and hold their breath for the day that the corporation actually, behaves on the level that they're expected to behave on, which again is socialized losses. And then will you have fun with your, down there? I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it ruins the name of markets and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, shoplifting is an interesting thing. I think, like, without getting directly into the shoplifting discussion, not that I don't want to, I just think it's an interesting discussion unto itself. But I think, like, from basic moral sentiment, anarchist type perspective, I think like every case is sort of nuanced, right? It's sort of like, okay, like we all hopefully understand why it's not really, I won't say problem, but it's let's use objectionable. It's way less objectionable, if not really objectionable, when someone who's starving takes an apple off an apple cart versus a rich kid on a lark shoplifting from Walmart, right? Like, we understand why these two things for different, and what's really, why are those two things different? If I just say that example, why do people's gut feeling moral sentiments have a contrast. If an
Right, yeah.
apple's taken, right? We're talking about the apple still has materially been removed from the cart. Someone has not purchased it, they've stolen it. But why are our moral sentiments and our human being feelings different when we talk about poor starving person takes apple from apple cart versus, let's say, a rich kid on a lark taking an apple from an apple cart? Well, because these are all about circumstances of privilege, economic circumstance, the context in which things are happening. So all that to say, I think one can easily justify for various reasons about the way I was sort of describing what I hope people through all that rambling sort of took away my value judgment is a very unjust in many ways state capitalist system that we currently live under. If you're at the, bad end of that stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and you're jacking some stuff from Walmart, I frankly don't care. I don't think that's going to
No,
be the
I can't bring
downfall.
myself.
I can't
Yeah.
bring myself to care. And I actually, you talk to some of these people, they probably make some good arguments about why they're justified in doing so. Although people like to portray these people as weird, whacked out, crazy people, those, the lower class is fucking shoplifting and look, they're out of
Mm-hmm.
control. These people often have a more gut feeling grasp on political theory than I think some of the most well-trained PhD supposed educated people have. So there's certain
Yeah.
things about moral sentiments that I think are more sort of like understood better at this quote street level, if we'll excuse the term. So I think I think, but then we can change variables in that equation too. And it's like, you know, uh, stealing from a genuine hippie hipster guy who's just making soap, you know what I mean? Like, and wants to
For,
sell his little artisan soap, and he carts himself to
mm-hmm.
town after bunking with his friends at some shitty rented trailer somewhere kind of thing. And I don't mean that as a value judgment. I just mean it's not a mansion kind of thing. You know what I mean? Well, then who's stealing from who and who's suffering and stuff? I'm not going to say, well, here's a competition of privilege. I'm just as okay with someone stealing from the hipster as I am okay with Walmart. I mean, all these things depend on context and circumstance, right?
But I generally agree with that. Though again, I keep thinking, is it just scale? The guy who has $1,000, don't steal from him, but the guy who has $1,001, it's probably fine. There's always a point where it becomes wishy-washy, more wishy-washy and less like I'm literally starving, I need that apple and stuff. But
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd rather again, for me, I'm not talking about I figured this out moral philosophy wise in a paper kind of. So I'm not saying it's watertight, but I think our moral sentiments and our human being gut feelings, like there's a reason why, as most human beings that haven't trained themselves out of this and sort of push this below the surface and become a politician, for example, and why most people, when you talk to them, they have this gut feeling why it's, let's say, again, let's use the spectrum of, it's less objectionable for someone who needs it to
mhm.
steal from someone with $1,000 versus someone who has $1, for example. So I think there's a bit of a scale question. I agree in that variable thing there. So that's always a variable there too. But I would also think you can also flip these variables in interesting ways. Like, I'm just imagining a society here. Let's say we have a guy who, sits on 40 acres and he built his little merchant corn empire by genuinely tilling his land. And all he does is he goes into town every weekend, sells his corn, and he's built his 40 acres and he just accumulated wealth through this. And he's just sitting there not bothering anybody. Let's say he's got $1 million in the bank, right?
Mhm.
Well, I would rather someone leave that person alone versus, for example, a corporation that's benefited from tons of state privilege, for example, that only has 500K in the bank. So that's where the scale
Sure, yeah.
question isn't as important to me. It's like, yeah, go steal from that mini Walmart. Let's call it the Lucy and Alex Mart. Go steal from the Lucy and Alex Mart. I don't care that it's smaller than Mr. Corn Empire. This guy genuinely mixed his time, effort, and personal possessions into this goal he had. He's off to the side, not bothering anyone. Meanwhile, these idiots used eminent domain, corporate privilege, and all these state subsidies to go mow down people's houses and stuff and drop their stupid mart on there. Yeah, go steal from them. Forget about the corn. So I guess it sort of depends all circumstantially.
Yeah, and then I started thinking, well, every grand reordering of society leads to horrible misery, so how are we ever going to alleviate these people's privileges that are built up on, bones and blood and
Yeah.
stuff, and then I'm like, man, I guess I can't fix everything by thinking hard. So
Yeah, no, it's true. We can't. That's a. I'm gonna steal that sentence. I love it. We can't fix everything by thinking hard. I agree with that. It's tough, right? I think the only if one is into um the what can we actually do attitude versus the I'm gonna sit off. Versus the I think we're fucked and I'm gonna sit off to the side. I didn't ask if we could swear on this podcast, by the way. I apologize.
we can, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. So if someone's into the sort of what can we actually do today mentality versus the we're fucked and I'm gonna sit off to the side and arm myself and wait this out, which I'll be honest, I'm actually feeling more pushed to the latter almost every day, and I try to resist it. But I'll be honest, that's where I'm at, kind of thing. But I also am pulled back by the what can we do tactically and practically. I don't think tactically and practically we're going to be in Canada or in the States or anywhere else presenting grand visions of radical revolution or even reformation
Hmm.
to the institutions and systems we have now. I think really like the best thing we can do tactically in the meantime is really chisel away at key pieces of these institutions and rules of the game that I've been talking about that are inherently unjust. And some might say, well, that's contradictory, Alex, because that's basically you sound like a radical guy, but you're really giving into reform. Well, no, let's be clear. I'm not giving into reform as an end goal. So the
Hmm.
reform versus revolution paradigm is a little bit more of an end goal oriented discussion to me. I'm not a reformist and end goal stuff. But I will say, in the meantime, if there's more practical roots in this lifetime to make seriously, even small changes that might make marginal trajectorial differences in the future, that's the practical things we should be aiming for. I think too many people like us sometimes yearn for that sort of ideal overthrow or whatever. And literal, I mean, social cultural revolution, not the act of
Hmm.
actually getting rid of people that are in the way or whatever. I'm talking about like the actual wheel turning type of revolution
Hmm.
in the literal word of the word. But I think sometimes we might be prone to being sad when we feel like that's not going to happen, but in reality there's various reasons it can't. Right
Hmm.
now, at least, if a lot of us organize better and create stronger networks and that kind of stuff, it is possible. I'm not saying it's impossible. Anything's possible. But in the meantime, I think setting unrealistic tactical goals and then having them fail and then feeling dejected, that's not a route and a way to go, if I'm making any sense on that point.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. I actually, though, I find myself sometimes I'm like, am I too anxious to be an anarchist? Because the idea of grand societal upheaval, even if somehow it was a net good thing,
Yeah.
is sort of scary. It's sort of too vast for me to even think about.
Yeah.
Um, but we don't need to decide right now. We can just chip away
Yeah.
at the worst systems, help people when we can and stuff. That's why I get very confused by, I'm just going to say, like your average normie Democrat being like, but what about the poor people? I'm like, well, I'm saying, like, why don't we get rid of, the DEA? Like, why is it all or nothing? Why is
Yeah.
it drone warfare? And
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's an odd fear that I think they have there.
Yeah, no,
Um,
yeah, I agree. And I'll also say too, like for whatever this is worth, because it's literally just personal experience, but it's something I found personally great power in, to be honest, is like, late anarchist author David Graeber in his Twitter bio still there. I think it still sits at something I think anarchism is something you do, so don't call me the anarchist anthropologist kind of thing. As in, like, it's not. It's just I do anarchism, and then I am an anthropologist, right? Well, like
mhm,
that anarchism is something you do thing. Like I was telling you a bit before we started recording, right? I've since relatively recently moved out to the country and stuff like that, and I've sort of adjusted a lot of my day to day thinking on what I'm literally doing beyond bringing in income to pay the state and living in state capitalism. And I've done more anarchy in this new mindset that I've had in the last 2 years than before. I'm writing less and
mhm,
podcasting in certain ways less and doing certain less intellectual quote unquote oriented things now. I think my writing output has declined, but I've since erected chicken coops, started trying to network with people in my area about, hey, like if I can actually get these guys laying like 30 eggs a day, you know what I mean? Because I have a lot of chickens now. It's like, if
mhm,
I give you eggs, like, can we do this? Like, hey, you have a tractor, maybe, hey, buddy, oh, this guy, he's only got so many acres, and he's like, I wish I could, I wish I could do corn somewhere. I'm like, why don't you come do corn on my property? I have this patch of grass that I'm not using. You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of power. Like the gospel I'm sort of preaching now to a lot of anarchists too is sort of like, is that Graeber quote. And I was sad one day and I looked at it and I was like, that was inspiring. It's like, it was like, it's something you also do. Anarchy and or even whoever's listening to this, like lowercase l liberalism, social pluralism, the work
Mhm.
community and the culture. And I'm not talking about the stuff that's sort of mild, like, oh, I volunteered here. Oh, well, that's important. I'm not, degrading it, but it's not about volunteering here, voting here, working this. It's like the stuff you do in your everyday life, I think, is also key to some degree to constructing the future you want. So, without getting too sentimental about it, I will say that I think, unfortunately, a lot of where the average person finds themselves in now, especially in like very hyper urban environments, is a situation where it is sort of that sort of catch 22. You got to make money to pay the ever growing state. And then there's the corporations, which are frankly, in many ways, the best type of employer. So if you join that labor army, you got to watch out what you're doing. A lot of people are sort of in this situation where they could be the most hardcore proponents of either reformism, radical revolution, or anarchism kind of thing. But are you doing that in your everyday life kind of thing? So I know that's a little
Mhm.
gospel-y and preachy, but I'm not saying it because I figured it out. I think I'm one of those people that permanently thinks I'm failing at everything we're talking about every day. So that's the way my brain works. So I'm in a constant state of failure and imposter syndrome. But I will say that I found comfort in actually not just talking about cooperation in an essay, but going to my neighbor adjacent and saying, you have this, I have this, why don't we trade? You have this, I have this. Why don't we go into town together and cut some trees and do arborist stuff, and we can make cash together and come back and do this with it. You know what I mean? Like there's stuff that's literally that one-to-one anarchistic, no state in sight interaction. Doesn't
Mhm.
involve big commerce, doesn't involve the state. That can be very comforting to the anarchist soul. And my gospel is, I think, wherever you find that, throw yourself at it. Not sure if that means anything to you or anybody, but I do take sort of liberty to sort of say that whenever I have the opportunity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do that when left to their own devices. Not that they're just like a noble savage, but you can live that without having um, all or even much high-minded philosophy at all if you don't really want to think that way. Um, and I'm wondering if I moved to like back to country type things, I would be more inclined to do that because literally across the street 24/7 is a big ass thin blue line flag
Yeah.
next to a Let's Go Brandon flag. So I don't want to like go up to them and be like, let us work together on um, our new corn empire or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't. Yeah. There's some tricky stuff
Well,
there.
I mean, that's the trickiness of, but you know what? I think that's the trickiness of like navigating things on an individual case by case basis. I said before, there's a certain type of Canadian small town conservatism that's largely distinct from, a lot of the thin blue line, let's go Brandon, economic nationalism, MAGA stuff that's happening there. I've met a lot of people in the country in the area that's just sort of like, look, like they're literally like, and they mean this when they say it. They're like, I don't give a shit, you're gay, whatever. Da, da, da. Look, I'm just doing my thing here. If I do my thing here, you do your thing there, I'm happy. Honestly, I know a lot of people in the States, it's like, regardless if that guy is sort of personally morally against gay marriage, like, the fact that someone's there, like, I don't give a shit. Just like, you
Mhm.
know what I mean? I mean, I know a lot of people in the States would welcome that back, like to
Yeah.
ratchet down this back to the point where people are literally like, I genuinely don't give a shit. Leave me alone. You do you. I do me. Like I was talking to a guy the other day. I'll just give an anecdotal example. I'm not sure if we're going overtime or undertime, so I apologize if I'm taking this everywhere.
I'm not
Um,
sure either.
so I'm good to keep going if you are. But I'll just say, like I met this guy and I genuinely believe him. Like I was at a
Mhm.
fire. Someone had a fire the other night, so I was like, come on over. Okay, whatever. So a bunch of people from the area get together. We were talking about it. And like he does like a lot of contracting, so he goes into the city, out of the city, so he's in Toronto area kind of thing. And he was talking to somebody, and there's also a generational aspect to this too, which I think is very key. This guy's about 30 years old, and
Mhm.
very rural guy, not very like political and like the sort of I'm going to open books every night sense, but got a good sense about him. And he was saying that he got into this conversation with somebody in the Toronto area, like urban progressive type, that was sort of like trying to convince him, like, whether you know it or not, you've been racist in your life. And he was basically saying, yeah, like, I'm sure like I've said some things I regret. Like, he's a very reasonable guy. He's like, sure, something to regret. He's like, but genuinely, he's like, I am not. And he was telling me this story that he was talking about this other person. And he's saying, I'm genuinely was not raised like that. He's like, I was raised to just say, I don't care if you're black or this or that. If we all work hard together, and this, that, the other thing, you do you, I do me, kind of thing, right? Unfortunately, this type of attitude has now been stereotyped because it's used in a dishonest way by a lot of far right people. And that's fair enough. We should be skeptical of people and poke at them and say, what do you really mean? So don't take anything for granted. I'm not saying that. But when this guy was saying it, like, I genuinely know that he was like honest about that. He's like, that's not the way I was raised. He's like mildly Christian, you know, believes sort of in Jesus stuff and like that kind of thing. Not Catholic, so he's not into hierarchy and all that stuff. I got that earful from him as well. So that's always great. Non-Catholics, I say as a cultural Catholic Italian that was baptized. Like, you know, like this type of stuff, I think, is the case-by-case navigation I was talking about earlier, right? Like, I agree with you. We have to watch out with like who's saying what and who's got thin blue line flags. Who are the people that say, I just want the government out of my life, but somehow they like billions of dollars of police domestic spending. I still don't know how that cognitive dissonance works.
You gotta have that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of the shoplifters, we need billions more for cops because of to save Walmart.
Exactly.
I don't know.
But I think there's also like anarchists should also be, if they have the opportunity, on individual case by case basis, like really talk to people and figure out who can contribute and be part of some sort of community network of cooperation, anything from the spectrum of casual, you know, you see them every now and then, through to like some of your best buddy type stuff. But I mean, you have to do that every day as well. I don't think, like you said, thinking hard about it is not going to solve it. So maybe I'm a little naive in this way, but I really do think that there's a lot of stuff to be said here too. And the fact that not everyone agrees with every single thing, we're not going to solve that in this lifetime either. But I will always, I've learned, you know, take that smoke and that beer at the sawmill now with someone who is genuinely honest about being happy with where they're at and not wanting the state to get out of control, and also just wanting them and their family to do well in their own quaint way, and somebody who's not off talking about right nationalism and all this garbage, but someone who's just sort of got that little bit of, hey, like, I just want to do me. There's always an entryway to talk more to people like that, even if they're not an out-and-out anarchist or the way, quote-unquote, one would like them to be. There's a lot more, back to one thing we were talking about before, there's a lot more potential there than a lot of hardcore, committed progressives. And I have to say, I know a lot of people don't like swallowing this pill because, you know, there's this whole social liberal thing. People like, at least there's that avenue. Go look at Canadian Twitter right now, because the leader of the Conservative Party went to the Calgary Stampede, which is like this annual event in Calgary, Alberta. Bull riding, chuck wagon races, good old Western cowboy hat stuff. And Justin Trudeau chose to, you know, do other things because he's literally hated at this point now in that area. He couldn't show his face there, although the Prime Minister does show up there. You know, and I always check locations on Twitter. Toronto-based, Vancouver-based progressive Twitter is alight with lower class trailer trash jokes. These are very nasty things.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's very like, you know, Pierre Poilievre would rather spend time with drunks, hungover, toothless stampeders. Like, people are literally saying this stuff, you know, than whatever, you know what I mean? So a lot of anarchists or left sympathetic people to the progressive side, yes, tactically these are fluctuating and, you know, alliances and tactical decisions that need to be made. But you also got to watch out for those progressives. Those are the bees in my bonnet now. Because since recent Canadian politics, I encourage people listening, go look into it. This stuff is nasty. Like, like a lot of these urban-based elite progressives just, you know, like, you literally talking about trailer trash, uneducated, low IQ people voting for not the Liberal Party. That's nasty. That is very nasty, non-human dignity recognizing stuff. That's problematic as hell too. So
I think we've got plenty of that. I mean, how many, you know, Southern jokes can you make? Or if some southern state passes some horrible law, there you get a ton of people saying, "Well, just abandon." Well, I'm thinking of Phil Oakes. Here's to the state of Mississippi. But the whole idea, like, well, let's just get rid of that state because it
Yeah.
sucks. It's like, well, the people live there, people who just got subjected to the law. Or I just saw, and God knows who the person was, but somebody insulting Charlie Kirk, who is terrible,
Yeah.
by calling him a college dropout, as if that's sort of,
Yeah.
as if that's the problem with him. Oh, lot of like, oh, not highly educated people do that with.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird.
And I honestly, I've been extra attentive to that now that I've moved out here. I'm not saying I'm surrounded by people that are stereotypical country people. I mean, there is one person a few lots down that is literally living in a trailer. There's a guy up here a few lots down that's in a nice big ass log house. You know what I mean? Like that's been like, marble tiled and stuff. So it's like there's all kinds of people here, but it's like I've been extra attentive to this kind of stuff too, and that progressive end of it. People seriously concerned with the liberal moral sentiment of equal human dignity and the basic Jesus lessons. I'm talking, secular Jesus, historical Jesus type stuff now. It's like, even though there's some things that the progressive side, they do check those checkboxes, got to be careful. The education thing, for some reason, is a huge sticking point. I don't know why a bunch of, I'll just say, frankly, most of the time, urban-based, progressive, relatively privileged millennial and Gen Z type of people whose parents sent them to university and now they don't really have much debt to pay off from that, or that kind of crowd effectively having something handed to them, is so happy to shit on people that, whether through no fault of their own or not or whatever, didn't have that same opportunity. I mean, to me, we kind of come full circle in this weird contradictory hypocrisy thing. I mean, so like I said, if anyone listening is interested and you want to dive into a nasty area of Twitter, go check out Canadian progressive circles right now. Talking about other types of voters. It's very interesting. So we got that. That's not good shit. Like I said, so there's you got those people on the progressive side, and absolutely you got the far right thin blue line flag, let's go Brandon, or economic nationalist types. Got to navigate it on a case by case basis. But I guess the point I'm making is there's some great people you could probably talk to that happen to be a little more progressive leaning. Those exist, but there's also some great people you could probably talk to that happen to be more conservative leaning too.
Yeah. I guess to those progressives, I say stop helping. People who are misogynistic about a horrible female politician, and like there's a big chunk of the supposed left who will do that. It's like, just
or
say
Trump's ex-wife for posing naked. Like, what the hell is that about?
That's the problem. Yeah, that's
but
the problem with her.
And that, some people try to exactly. And some people try to dismiss that. Oh, there's just a small section. But no, that's not a small section of people. This is like every mainstream type of media-ish type of. This is like a cycle of stuff. There's tons of people that fancy themselves smart, average, Joe Biden voters or whatever. Well, at least this president's wife she's a doctor. I'm like, guys,
she's classy.
Yeah, classy.
She's never been naked in her life.
Yeah, exactly. And then they turn around in Congress talk about those cold-hearted conservatives and their classism. I'm like, well, let's watch out here, right? So
yeah. The reason that Hillary Clinton is terrible and not because she's a woman, contrary to most critiques I've ever seen of her.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the least of the things that
the least of her
need to be discussed. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I am missing my non-Serviam meeting. Hopefully, we leave this in. No, I could demand you go on tangents all day. And theoretically, I suppose we didn't hit some of the stuff that one of our people helpfully helped write the questions about. So maybe we can get you on again here sometime. And if there's something more specific we want to talk about, though I think we talked about everything in the world.
The broad strokes for sure. And I apologize if I went too long in certain places.
No, I just get distracted when I'm interested. It is not actually a very good quality in a podcast host, but them's the breaks. Now, did you have 3 media recommendations for me in terms of things that influenced you, things that people should check out?
Yeah. So I did unfortunately only read your email before the podcast as soon as we hit record, basically. So that's my fault, not yours. But I will say I'll maybe think of 3 ultimate ones for another time if I'm ever back on, as you said. But the 3 that came up in this conversation or that made me think of certain things I'll talk about now. If people want to understand a lot of what's happening today as far as law and legal stuff, I definitely recommend the Transformation of American Law book by Morton J. Horowitz. That's very important for people that want to
I'll look that up myself.
Yeah, that's a great one for people that want to take a tour into not what the intellectual pundits and classes and elites were enjoying and thinking about, which is often what most historical projects are about. Like when they say, well, what were people thinking about in 1850? It's often, let's see what the New York Times was saying. Let's see what the London Times were saying. If we want to take a dive into what, for example, average people or the working class people were thinking, that sort of flavor, Jonathan Rose's Intellectual History of the British Working Classes, for example, is is an amazing tour. And although it's nonfiction, I was reading it. I was emotional at times. I was happy. I was sad. There's parts of the book that'll make you cry, kind of thing. He's using people's journal entries and diaries and stuff to piece together. So it's a beautiful book. So that's one there I would say as well. And then if you're sort of interested, I guess, in anything I had to say about the sort of lowercase l, just broad liberal moral sentiments we were talking about, I strongly suggest anyone goes and reads one or two Adam Smith major works, right? Like Theory of Moral Sentiments, Wealth of Nations. It's a tall order, but I think even if someone is somebody that just hates everything to do with markets or even market anarchism or anything we talk about, but like I would say at the very least one would be very surprised to discover who the real Adam Smith was, especially in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, for example. Not only is there a lot of great stuff going on in Wealth of Nations, but especially in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Like, for instance, in Wealth of Nations, at the beginning of the book, he talks about division of labor. At the very towards the end, a few hundred pages in, he talks about, effectively, I'm paraphrasing, if everyone just divisions of labor so hard and human beings are only relegated to one individual task, they're going to become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become. So that's a problem, right?
Yes.
So that's the real Adam Smith, worried about the human condition, inquiring about who we are, and really trying to see how, who are we, what makes us tick, and how do we flourish, and what's the average person. That's the key, how the average person could flourish. That's the real Adam Smith. So there's my recommendations.
All right, those are respectable. I was trying to subtly Google how long those dang books are, but I didn't manage to at the beginning of this podcast. But I know that I've seen an officially abridged version of The Wealth of Nations, so I'm pretty sure that's a massive tome.
And you got to watch out. Sorry, not to take you, but you got to watch out whose version's published and stuff. Some people have weird ones, but I would recommend going to there's a there's a story, and I haven't checked this myself, but apparently the Chicago School edition, one of the editions they published of The Wealth of Nations in the index, somehow missed division of labor as a term of reference to the section I talked about. It's at the beginning part where so I think Chomsky likes talking about that. And then there's I forget his name, and I apologize. There's a modern Adam Smith scholar that I was at a lecture, and he sort of casually mentioned that, I guess the people in Chicago they either didn't know about that reference, or who knows what happened there, but they forgot.
Conspiracy.
About that. Yeah, so who knows?
Perhaps.
But I recommend people go to Adam Smith Works, because there's a lot of great resources of Adam Smith there. And if you want to email me or anybody else that's associated with Adam Smith Works, they'd be happy to talk about Adam Smith to you. But honestly, please do it if you're listening. But also, too, why I'm getting to this point is because they will gladly suggest chapters you can skip. If you know what I mean? Sure. So there's a whole digression and a bunch of pages.
I might need that myself.
Yeah, there's a whole digression and a bunch of pages on silver, coinage, and all this kind of stuff. Like if you talk to somebody,
people were really into silver back then.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to hear someone like, for instance, someone like myself or anyone else that you find at Adam Smith Works, you just advise you on, I want to, if you drop a line to those people and say, I want to read Adam Smith and I really want to get to the moral sentiment, lowercase l liberal stuff, they'll tell you how to remove pages out of it in a very honest way. That does not give you the I want the post World War II Cold War William Buckley Smith, right? So there's real Smith scholars at Adam Smith Works.
All right, duly noted. Where can the good listeners find you on the internet?
The only thing I'm mostly doing right now
wait.
is... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh my god. One of my people is gonna beat me up for the cappuccino question. I always forget it. Oh my goodness. All right, let's pretend that didn't happen. I have one final question for you, and that is, how would I acquire a cappuccino in your political utopia? If there's any summation of that, that's possible.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'm being too particular. I'm thinking, as in, like, you mean like how would that work? Is what the question really means?
Yeah, I mean the footnote on the question, I suppose, is like, how would I acquire a luxury good that I would like to acquire? Whether or not you think it's an important thing in our new society or what have you.
Yeah.
I think that's it's just
If they're not around, I would say you and I and other people can get together and we would figure it out. If we can get the beans here, then I got the milk and the rest of it covered. So that's a stupid answer to the question, but that's my honest feeling about it. My other flippant answer is I don't know, and if we were living in the utopia, I might not care as well. So.
Well, there's going to be cappuccino riots in a minute if you don't give it to the people.
Certainly in some places in Toronto, yes. And yes, and if any Torontonians are listening, I actually do love you. I just bash Toronto because it's the proper Canadian, not Toronto thing to do.
I didn't know that. I've learned so much about Canada today.
Yeah, I also some might have noticed I pronounce it Toronto instead of Toronto.
Well, you do have some Canadian other things sneaking in there, like Zed.
Oh, yes.
The dreaded Zed.
I like Zed, but that might be another podcast topic. But I think Zed's better than Z for different reasons.
I like to pretend to feel passionately committed to whatever America decided on a thing. Yeah,
that's
like
fair.
the matrix system makes way more sense, but that's not what I learned.
Yeah,
so.
I know what you mean. But fun Canadian fact. I'm sorry you're over time, but I really like to get this in. We again. Have like the best of both worlds. We're formally metric, but talk to any contractor. We're not doing shit in centimeters. We do like go to Home Depot. It's 2x4s, 4x4s. I built something the other day with my neighbor. It's sort of like 6 inches, 12 inches. We're on inches in Imperial. We're not doing, why don't you cut me a 100-centimeter board there? So that's
good.
Yeah. So we do practical things in Imperial. For some reason, my height on my driver's license is in centimeters. But I say I'm 5'8" or whatever, 7 1/4 or whatever I'm saying at that time. You know what I mean? Depending what shoes I'm wearing, I guess.
So much Canada.
Yeah,
that people are going to learn about when they listen to this.
I hope it wasn't boring.
I don't think so. Okay, for reals this time. No fooling. Where can the good listeners find you on the internet?
Yeah, so I'm sort of I've been using less Twitter these days, but I sort of use that as a bit of my online presence type based thing. So at Alex Aragona on Twitter, I'm there. My writing's at c4ss.org. So my index is there. I've also I have written for Adam Smith Works, and also there's some stuff out at Liberal Currents and stuff like that. That's my main presence.
That sounds good. As always, you can find Non-Serviam on the thing we used to call Twitter and still do out of spite, on Blue Sky, on Mastodon, on Instagram. We're everywhere on the internet. So you should come find us if you haven't already. And with that, Alex, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm very glad you joined me today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was great.
You're listening to the Non-Serviam podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.